Hi, I'm Maggie from Personal Euphoria, and today I wanted to go over some modifications that you can do when taking certainly a Pilates class, but really they translate to almost any fitness class you might be taking. And modifications are always important so that you can participate in a class safely. But I feel like they're especially important now when everybody's doing virtual classes, because I know as an instructor, I look to my class to try to cue, to give people an idea to get safer form. And over the internet, a virtual class, it's hard to see that. Or if someone has their camera turned off, I don't get to see that for them. So that you can have the tools of ways to modify, we're doing this video. Now, I'll also mention one of the perks about having modifications when you're working out from home is I do think very often in fitness classes, our ego gets in the way. So we're embarrassed to use the modification we need. At home, you don't have to be. No one can see you except maybe the instructor, and everyone else, you're a 1-inch image on their screen and they're busy watching the instructor. So you can totally take the opportunity during these virtual classes to modify and hopefully notice how much better the modification feels in your body. So first off, we're going to start with wrist issues. So anytime you need to put weight in your wrists and that bothers you, you have a few options. One, I very often make spider fingers. So instead of breaking at my wrist, where the wrist is flat on the mat, I break at my fingers or sort of prop up on my fingers. So just in case you can't see that, instead of being flat on a surface like this, I kind of do this on the surface. So you can play with that, or I have very bendy, flexible fingers, so I kind of do this on the surface. You might not like that better, but it's an option. The other option is to make a fist and have straight wrists. Now, this puts less pressure because you're not breaking at the wrist, but you have to have strong enough wrists that wrist won't rock back and forth on you and have you wiggle there. Also, you can always, for almost all exercises on all fours, depending on what you're doing, come down onto your forearms and then you're on your elbows instead of your wrists. And you could do any glute exercise here, right? Something like swimming on all fours might be awkward, but you could still do it. It's still manageable, okay? And another option for the wrists would be to take your mat or roll up a towel and kind of put your hands on the edge of the roll. And that just makes it so the break at the wrist is not so harsh. Your wrist is higher than your fingers, and though you might be putting your same body weight on it, it changes the pressure point. So certainly some options to play with for your wrists there. Next, if you're doing a seated exercise, ideally your back is neutral, meaning you have the natural curves of your spine. Very often to have straight legs, people wind up tucking under, and then they do the exercises, whatever you're gonna do from here. And it puts a funny torque on the back to do that. So the simplest modification is to bend the knees so that you can sit up a little bit taller and then do the move from that neutral spine. You could always cross the legs and sit tailor style, depending on the exercise. So if you were gonna roll back, you wouldn't be able to do that. But if you were gonna do any seated twisting things, that would be okay. Or any seated things where you round forward, that would generally be an option. And another option would be to prop yourself up higher. So you could sit on a pillow if it will support you and not completely sink in under your weight. You could, even here, roll the mat again. That'll only give you a little extra lift, but you could sit up on your mat for a little extra lift and legs straight, and that little bit of lift will help you. You want your sits bones lifted, okay? If you had like a step from cardio aerobics in your house, or a box that can support your weight, you could sit yourself up so that your butt is a couple inches off the ground on that object. So for example, in Pilates, we often use what's called an arc barrel, And you could sit up higher. And then if you're gonna roll away, it's more comfortable on the hips and low back. So for any seated exercises, you wanna get your hips a little higher, the knees a little more bent, or sit Taylor style, okay? Now, if you're gonna be lying down, doing exercises with the legs in the air, if you bring your legs up and you have strain in the back, or you don't have strain, but you feel like you have no control, so when the legs move away from you, you feel like the arch in your back increases, you have choices here. You can always start with one foot on the floor, one in the air, and whatever you're doing, work with one leg. Or if you're being cued in the class to do something with straight legs, try bending the legs and see if that enables you to control where your pelvis stays positioned, right? Because you don't want the pelvis to arch more without you allowing it to. But there's almost no move where we're looking to let that happen when we move our legs. So if you can't keep your pelvis stable when the legs move away, you need one foot down for the time being. Also, some people find it helpful to stick their own hands kind of under the bottom of your butt. And then that little bit of lift will help. If you have a small stability ball, one of those really tiny ones, putting that under your hips, depending on the exercise, can be helpful. Or sometimes a yoga block, depending on the exercise, can be helpful. I know I'm trying to be broad here, so every exercise might require a little something different. But what you want to remember is to listen to the body. If when your legs come into the air, bent or straight, your back starts screaming or your hips start screaming, you need to take some load off. And you could do that by putting one foot down and working one side at a time. Next, modifying for the neck. The simplest is to put the head down. So if you are curling up and down, that's a little bit harder because we are going to be moving up and down, and if you keep the head down, there's no move. But if you're curling up and holding for any exercise and the neck is straining, you want to put the head down. It doesn't make the work go away. It changes what has to work to do the exercise, okay? So the worst place to let the neck go is half up, half down. So you start up here, and as you get tired and those abs release, you kind of wind up here. That's going to strain the neck most of all. So put it down, and you can always come back up and do fewer reps. Okay. So the other thing for the neck is to be mindful that it's moving with your spine. So if you were to round away and your chin is crammed to the chest, just think about where your chin is and your neck in line with your spine. If you're going to do something like a side bend, try to notice sometimes people's head doesn't go with them. So try to let your neck go and see if that feels okay. If you're going to bend back, often people are hypermobile in the neck. So check in. Is the neck in line with the spine on the back bend? And it's going to feel like a much smaller move, but it's going to be safer for your neck, okay? Also, when you're lying down, you can use your hands to support your head, but be cautious of this one because very often when people do that, they end up sort of pulling on their head, tugging it forward. That is not the goal. You want to feel like your head is heavy in your hands, but the hands are supporting the weight of the head. So you also don't want your elbows out wide or it creates extra work for you. You want the elbows comfortably in, right? So if you were doing this, you wouldn't have the elbows wide. You're not squeezing your head. You have the elbows pointing softly up to the ceiling. So if you want to play with that, come up and make sure you can feel that your head is heavy in your hands and then your hands support it through the movement. You can even use your mat for this. So you could hold onto the corners of your mat and let your head stay against the mat as you curl up. Now, if you're using your arms in another capacity, this isn't possible, but just options to play with to help increase ab strength without hurting your neck. For your hip flexors, if you are really tight in those hip flexors, it's a lot of similar concepts for the back, right? So when you're lying down, you'd want to work one leg at a time, or you want to bend the knee. So if you were doing something like leg circles and your hip was popping and clicking or hurting, you could bend your knee and try to take some pressure off. Not guaranteed to solve the whole problem, but certainly a first step. So if anything with straight legs is bothersome, you can bend the knee, you take pressure off those hip flexors. And just like the low back, you can always put a foot down. And it's the same thing if you're seated. If you are tight here when you sit up, straightening the legs might help you, right? And lifting up onto something like that arc barrel I showed for the back would be helpful. And finally, the knees. If your knees are tender, so let's say kneeling is not a good choice for you. When you need to kneel in a class, you have a couple of options. One, you can grab a towel, right? A big towel like you would shower with, and roll it up and put it under your knees, or you can try putting your mat folded multiple times under your knees. If all you need is some extra padding, that's the easy fix, and you can do that even when you come onto all fours. Otherwise, depending on the exercise, very often, if you would have been on all fours, you can lie down on your stomach and do a very similar exercise as to what's being done on all fours. If you are needing to kneel tall, you can almost always, again, depending on the exercise, come to a seated position, legs crossed or straight, right? And then you move from the waist, and you might lose part of the leg work, but it's not worth the pressure on the knees. Now, if your knees worry you during an exercise like a squat, so if you're going to do whether it's a parallel squat or a squat and turnout, as always, you always want to make sure your knees and feet are tracking with each other. That's important. But trust that you can start small. So if your knees bother you on a squat, you can do a very small range of motion and try to feel that the muscles are doing the work for you. You're not kind of just like loosely bouncing in those joints, right? As you train within that small range of motion and the knees get comfortable with that, hopefully they'll build to getting comfortable with a bigger range of motion. But just allow the movement to be smaller and know that it can come over time. I think sometimes when the knee hurts in a squat, it is that our form is getting a little sloppy. But you might not be in a place where you could correct that form all the way down into a deep squat. So start with that smaller range of motion and build as you get stronger and feel that it's your muscles doing the work, not that you're hanging out in that joint. So these are just some modifications that I hope will make classes feel better for you and help you get stronger faster. Because if you try to muscle through where you're not ready to move yet, your body is sort of fighting you. It probably won't make progress as fast as if you ease off and do the exercise from a point where you have control and your best power. And again, no time like the present to do that while you're at home virtually taking classes. But if there's another modification you need to see, feel free to reach out and I'll try to do another video and build off of this. But otherwise, modify as needed and make sure your movement feels good. But always keep moving.